feel like the pressure is on because let's say I'm the prelude to tacos and golf and steak. I'm a little concerned that everyone is just kind of waiting for this to be over. Today these last two talks actually move me into the field where I do the most work. This first one is going to be a period that has grown to be one of my most beloved periods in the history of art. It's something that it was a big eye-opener to me in Rome to begin to follow a course of reading. I started with one book and then I went to another book, and I found, literally kind of like your oil boom, I found this incredible vein of art history about 2 miles down and 2 miles in, lodged between the rocks. I found a vein of art history that really shows us the incredible importance of the Christian church, but the Catholic Church, in the development of the period of art that the world respects the most, which is the Renaissance. If we, as the church, are culturally still, big players in the modern world, it's because we did produce these incredible geniuses of Michelangelo and Raphael and Leonardo, and these works that fill museums and still to this day change people's lives. Those works that's going to be the second lecture we do this morning. But what is amazing is the fact that this did not come out of nowhere. And again, I'm going to give you a little bit of my own. All these talks, all this sort of thing for me is always a reminder of my personal journey in art history. And people often say, are there a lot of books on this subject? And unfortunately, there aren't. And it really has been a kind of odd voyage of discovery for me to understand these things about our faith and art. I mean, I've always been attracted to art, and as a matter of fact, originally I was completely uninterested in the faith aspect. I got into art because I liked mythology, so I thought great pagan stories put together with pretty pictures was a fab idea. Then gradually, as the years have gone by and a number of interesting flukes, it's become clearer to me that my whole first half of my art historical training was really done in such a way to purposefully and intentionally deny any participation on the part of faith in the creation of art. And so I'm just going to give you this, I'm going to give you off the bat the thesis that I'm refuting today. Both talks today are refuting a thesis, which if any of you have taken an art history course, you probably have heard this thesis. It's the most prevalent one in the history of art. And the question becomes, what is the Renaissance? The answer is the Renaissance is when the enlightened people of the 16th century ditched religious subject matter and ideals and replaced them with secular ones drawn from the virtues of the ancients. And the minute we did that, everything got a whole lot better. We left that kind of crazed, dogmatic art of the Middle Ages, the most vague word, I forgot, Mannerism, Byzantine, and Middle Ages, 3 incredibly misused terms. We left that kind of, Gothic, dogmatic, disturbing art of the repressed Middle Ages, and we opened up to this new world. Today's first lecture is not true. Okay, is my point. So we're going to be starting out with the fact that once there was an alliance between men and art. There was between faith and art. Yeah, I cannot do anything without putting Lord of the Rings in it at some point. It was inevitable that Lord of the Rings would show up in these lectures. The greatest modern tragedy is that my students not only have not seen the movies, but God forbid, have read the books. I have high hopes that The Hobbit might get people back up on Tolkien line. At any rate, there once was an alliance between art and faith. That alliance was very, very strong. We saw that. We've seen that from the beginning of art and the way that art helps in the age of heresy, the way that art helps to express this unique situation of the history of humanity, God's self-revelation. We've seen art battle through the difficulties of iconoclasm. And so we come to this period where we have, in the post-iconoclast period, we have a tremendous amount of influence from the Greek world in our art. Art in the Greek world is a very conservative preservation of theology. As I was saying yesterday, since it is an illustrated theology, it tends to be a lot more codified, something that's a little harder for the West to deal with, because in a certain sense, Western Europe is a kind of it's kind of a wild West artistically. There's a tremendous amount of individual expression and desire for individual expression. These works tend to be read as as they're meant to be read as each aspect is a symbolic meaning. The major characteristics of this kind of art is going to be no background. The background is generally a golden background to understand that you're being removed from space and time. The emphasis is always on the extraordinary peculiarity of Mary, Mother of God, and Christ child, God. You'll notice heavy outlines, very, very frontal, and the faces are actually designed with the sense of meaning. Small mouth, Mary doesn't talk much, large throat, imbued with the Holy Spirit. But what I'm getting at is this is an art that's not about a narrative that is connected to the day-to-day experience. It takes the beholder, it takes the faithful, transports the faithful from his or her surroundings and brings him into a contemplative meditation of points or theological points that are outside this realm. This does translate. I'm sorry, there are so few images from this period. This is a period that is tragically underrepresented in art. But I'm trying. This is a series of paintings that were discovered in St. Lawrence outside the wall. They're from the 13th century. Is about the most decent picture I can get of something that early. There are some fresco cycles that are produced in kind of 1000, 1100. The only problem is the later periods, they don't like that art. And so the custom is to just paint them over and destroy them. A fun fact, and if anybody is nurturing art history, future art historian graduate students, one of the most interesting fields that is coming up in art history, if I were to do it all over again, I would actually do exactly what I did, because my relationship with Michelangelo can't be broken, I'm afraid. But the fact is that there is a really exciting field for young art historians right now, which is in the art of this period. Having exhausted all the other veins, they're beginning to rediscover technologies, allowing us to rediscover these old painting cycles. The thing that is problematic is that the people who are working on these painting cycles, all produced for churches, all produced during this very intensely scholastic medieval period, it's all being done by atheists. I mean, by people who really have a very strong, this is all about internal church politics, this is all about internal church politics. So what I would love to see in the future would be some people, so a group of young art historians who start to work in this field and try to draw out the very lively, active faith that we already know is happening in the theological circles of the universities, and be able to apply that to the art. I close my little diatribe parentheses, but I keep making this call because I'd love to see some of the people on our side in this field instead of the things that I've been reading coming out of these new discoveries. At any rate, what I really wanted to show you here is these are the stories of St. Lawrence. So St. Lawrence is being beaten over here, he's being interrogated over there. One thing you'll do to notice, the representation of the human body is really not that interested in what a human body actually looks like. It has a very kind of stylized form. The proportions of the body are odd, to say the least. And again, there is no sense of a depth or a background. There's no sense of giving you room to move inside these fresco cycles. So you look at these and you take in the data of what is happening to Lawrence, but you are neither invited to step into the experience as a witness. You don't feel like you're part of the story. And secondly, you don't empathize with the actual suffering of this person who was actually killed in this manner, in this place 1800 years ago. So it doesn't fully capture, it just informs you, it reminds you, but it doesn't, as we were talking about yesterday, stimulate that idea of piety, as we were talking about with the Trent rules. And then along came St. Francis. And the arrival of St. Francis is going to come into a very, I forgot my little cheering noises. Along came Francis and Dominic. And today I'm going to be talking to you particularly about the Mendicant orders. Something that a very important art historian, Monsignor Timothy Vernon, who's a canon of the Cathedral of Florence, noted, it's very interesting that for these, one of the greatest centers for art, one of the greatest centers for the reflowering of art, one of the greatest patrons of art is going to be among these orders who close themselves off from the world. I mean, the whole idea of these mendicants and this refusal of possessions and living off in this, and the Benedictines, of course, are the kind of the kings of this, living off, separated in this kind of sense of rejection of worldly things. These are the people who are going to be most sensitive and most helpful and most nourishing of art history. And again, these people are going to be the ones that, even though the world and its pomps they step away from, this creation of a world, this production of the world, a reproduction of an ideal world, a place to go, a place to assist in meditation and contemplation, is something that they will take huge strides in. And so the Franciscans and the Dominicans come in a very, very particular moment. And again, it's I don't mean to preach to the choir, so I'm just going to bring out the 2 or 3 points that I think are essential of understanding the context of Francis. Francis I always find very fascinating because Francis's era is very close to our own. It seems hard to believe, but Francis's era is an era when, for the very first time in all of Europe, people are making a great deal of money by dint of their own efforts. You don't need to be the scion of some important family in Italy. You are a guy with an idea, your bit of resources, and you can start to make quite a bit of money, a comfortable living, and some people will reach, within the next generation after Francis, they will reach the highest heights by their capacities, by their own hard work and determination. This is very much the America of the 13th century. There are a lot of things that give rise to it. This is not the place for it. But the fact is, Francis's father was one of those guys. He was not one of those people who was from the top of the hill in Assisi, one of the aristocrats who had moved in from the countryside because they saw there was a bit of city life and sort of continued to run their plantations out there and sat on the top of the hill and tried to continue a life of aristocracy, while you had on the lower part of the hill all the merchants and the people who were buying and selling and traveling and making a living and dyeing cloth and always figuring out new opportunities and new ideas. And Francis grew up in an environment where this man had succeeded. He had done everything for his son. Here he has this son, he's done everything, he's given his son a great life, and his son doesn't want it. I can't help but feel that the story of Francis's father must have been very interesting that day in Assisi. Francis rejects all of these things that people think are so important. He's got money. He's got the possibility of developing a little status by being a soldier. He's got everything a young man. Nice clothes. They didn't have cars back then, but he's got everything a young man should want, and he rejects it. And so Francis becomes an amazing visual example of, just at the moment when everybody thinks this is what it means to have it made, Francis walks around and shows you in the first person. I cannot begin to emphasize how important the physical witness of Francis is. That Francis walks around, the son of a clothes merchant, wearing rags. That Francis walks around acting silly, where everybody of that particular social set wants to fit in, wants to look so important. Francis is running around hauling rocks, talking to birds, acting crazy all the time. Happy. Every time you laugh at him, he's happy to be a fool for God. And everything he does, and every time you say to Francis, what is wrong with you? He says, I love Christ, I want to be like Christ, I want to be exactly like Christ. And you can look at that man and get a sense of what it was like to look at Christ. The visual witness of Francis is one of the pillars of this talk, and it's one of the pillars of the humanism of the Renaissance. Dominic, who is going to occupy a lesser part of this talk, however, Dominic is very, very dear to me, and important to the history of art in another way, and it will come to its full flowering at a later point. Dominic's role in all this is that in the 11th century, the first universities are formed. And when the first universities are formed in Italy, you start to get all these young people who start to go to school. You all know where I'm going with this. They all start to go to school. They all start to learn a little Plato. They all start to learn a little, they aren't learning Aristotle yet. They all start to learn a little this. They all start to learn a little Greek. They all start to learn a little of that. And all of a sudden they learn a little bit too much. And who needs God? Who needs faith? Who needs parents? Who needs wisdom? Who needs tradition? I'm so smart, I can do it on my own. And so from that point, we start to get another age of rather intensive heresies. And Dominic is formed to be able to argue out those heresies. And so Dominic's order, the point of their order, is to understand, to pray. Everything they do is to understand so that they can transmit. And obviously the principal forms of transmission are going to be their writings and their preaching, order of preachers. But the fact is that the Dominicans will also rest very heavily on art, because if the idea is to contemplate, to understand, to transmit, then art becomes for them, Dominic and the Dominicans see, yes, art, we can use that to transmit. So what I'm putting you in the place for is what I'm putting in place is a vision of the Dominicans and the Franciscans. The Dominicans who have to transmit the fruit of their understanding, they will be very interested in furthering art. The Franciscans who have among them a man who is an alter a Cristo, a visual representation, a work of art in a similar to Christ, it gives people the idea of visual witness. And so they will be very, very interested in art. There are so many people who are deeply influenced by the Franciscans. I think a lot of people don't realize Dante was a Giotto, we will talk about a lot today. He was a third order Franciscan. Michelangelo was a third order Franciscan. People ask me all these questions about Michelangelo. I'm like, well, you might want to take into consideration he was a third order Franciscan, so that he was interested in the Immaculate Conception. I don't know, might make a little sense. You also have Dante, who is also a third order Franciscan. And so these people are all, these are huge influences on the cultural life of all of Italy. And all of them are very, very close. They are engaged in the Franciscan spirituality. The Dominicans gave us two artists, two magnificent painters. Fra Angelico, I think you all know. Fra Bartolomeo, who apparently was so humble he refused to have any portraits done of himself. So we don't have any pictures of Fra Bartolomeo. But he was a painter who was so moved by the Dominican spirituality that he actually gave up painting several years and joined the Dominican order, and then after a while he returned to painting. And a fun fact that nobody seems to ever pay any attention to is that he and Raphael were very, very close friends during Raphael's time in Florence. So this kind of already, I just want you to see that there's a lot of connection going on behind the scenes between these religious orders and these artists, so that there's a lot, people say, who wrote the theological program of the Sistine Chapel? All right, Michelangelo did not write the theological program of the Sistine Chapel. It's kind of like saying, Liz wrote the commentary on the Summa Theologica. It's just not going to happen. But the fact of the matter is that Michelangelo's world is so permeated with theologians, with preachers, with philosophers, with really good parish priests, that it's part of his formation. And I'm sure the theological program actually comes from many different sources, many different conversations, because this is the world he lived in. So I am starting with what I consider the great bastion of the new art, and it's the Upper Basilica of Assisi. The Franciscans, they preach. And one of the more important things that the Franciscans are going to want to do is to make sure, there's that famous line of Francis, the one it's attributed to him, although probably not by him. It's the line, preach always, and when necessary, use words. And so the fact of the matter is that the Franciscans, they preach. Francis, you can't get him to stop talking in one way or another. He's always preaching. The Franciscan buildings are going to be the first great ground for this new art. Franciscans have a very specific MO in their church building. They use heavy, heavy wall space. They're very Romanesque buildings. If you look along the sides, the entire side of the building is filled in wall. Given the fact that we've been seeing in this period, they start putting in side chapels, lots and lots of side chapels. The fact that the Franciscans make a continuous run of wall, and then they make high and narrow windows so they can keep large wall spaces between the windows, it's because the Franciscans want the walls to preach. The churches are designed to take painting. They are designed from the very beginning to be covered with paintings, so that when they're not speaking, then the walls are speaking. When the candles are blown out and the incense fades away and the last chords of the singing fades into the distance, the people who are standing in that church continue to be preached through the brilliant colors of the art. So an entire surround sound preaching space is what happens when they build the Basilica of St. Francis. It's already done. The first cycle of decoration is done in 1280, and then in 1300 they'll begin the spectacular cycle that we all know and love in the basilica. And of course, we have endless images in the basilica of Francis preaching. I think there are 5 or 6. I actually have the number written down in my notes, but I don't even want to bother trying to find them. It's 5 or 6 images that are specifically showing Francis preaching, whether he's preaching to birds, or whether he's preaching to the Sultan, but Francis is usually preaching to somebody. He's preaching to the Pope now, and the Pope is listening. And this is the heart of what puts human in humanism. This part is where we get a little bit less theoretical and a little bit more technical in what happens. Francis's life, Francis's whole existence, everything he does is, as I was saying, it gives the idea of it's a Christ-like life to the point where people see him as a visual witness. Jesus has not been around for 1,200 years, but if you want to get a vague sense of what he was like, well, you can look at that guy. And so Francis's whole, every moment he wakes up, everything he does it in such a way that he can be a visual work of art. A work of art in the sense that a work of art, none of the pictures we saw or will ever see can possibly make you understand what God is. And so one human man cannot make you understand what Jesus is, but he can give you an idea. He can give you a glimpse. And that's what Francis does. Francis, all of his efforts culminate in the miraculous event of his stigmata, which, make no mistake, in his age, it was like an earthquake. The Franciscans made sure everybody knew about the stigmata. He is the first stigmatist, except for St. Paul. I don't want to get into this argument. But he is, whether or not we're taking St. Paul, it's been a while since there's been a stigmata. And the fact of the matter is that it is for Francis and for the world around Francis, this is a big endorsement on the part of the Lord himself, saying, yep, that guy looks so much like me. He even looks like me. Notice the signs in his body. And so Francis, Altera Christo, the man whose life is totally dedicated to the Passion of Christ, the man who writes his own office of the Passion with all sorts of very innovative reflections in the Passion, including, it's the Franciscans who will give us the emphasis on images of the mocking of Christ. So that crown of thorns I was showing you, of Annibale Carracci, that use of iconography actually comes in with the Franciscans, who make this big point of not only did Jesus physically suffer, not only did Jesus suffer the betrayal of all his friends and followers, but Jesus also suffered what for the 13th century would be just as difficult for the 13th century as it would be for the 21st. He was laughed at. There he is, can you imagine standing there being, in many ways, our worst fear. I think many people would rather just be punched in the nose than laughed off the stage. And so I think Francis really, in his world, where his generation are the first people who are kind of, standing up on their own 2 feet. These people are not important because they're fathers, because of a bloodline. The people of Francis's world, they are important because, well, I did this and I did that and I worked really hard. And those people, that's a very, very, very fine pedestal to be standing on. Those people fear being laughed at the same way we do. The same way that people in our world fear most anything. The most deadly thing you can do to us is a roast, right? And so the fact of the matter is that Francis's willingness, he courts laughter so as to be able to experience even that part of Christ's suffering. And as people begin to realize how complete his meditation, how complete his understanding of Christ's passion is, it changes the way we think about Christ's passion. I showed you the first crucifixion yesterday, and I told you right from the very beginning, the Santa Sabina crucifixion wants to gloss over the suffering, the death, and we go straight to resurrection. We want a Jesus who is triumphant in this period. The 5th century Jesus, yes, they crucified him, but he came back to life. 3 days, but collapsed into 20 seconds. And so we see a monumental, biggest figure in the center already in that representation of resurrection. I showed you an interim one yesterday. It was a Greek from Santa Maria Antiqua, where we see what we call the Christus triumphans. So we see Christ triumphant on the cross. It means a Christ who is alive on the cross. That is the image of Christ from Santa Sabina until 1200. No image has ever been found between the Santa Sabina 450 to the image of, this is a Pisa crucifix from the 11th century. Jesus is always represented as alive on the cross. His hands are open, he stands up straight, he's looking out at you. You have these historiated crosses. These are very popular in the 11th century. You have the stories of the passion that surround the crucifix. We have very few left. These again, these poor, they're 1,000-year-old pieces of wood. Unfortunately, I think, hey, what are you doing? I think that's a sign that I'm talking too much and the computer gets tired of listening to me. The fact is that there are only 25 left of them. So granted, our research into this is a little, we don't have that many to go on. But the fact is all 25 are variations on this form. The San Damiano crucifix, I think, is the one that you would know best. The San Damiano crucifix is also a 12th century object. It was inside it's the famous church that spoke to St. Francis. And it's amazing when you think about it. I just want you to stop for a second and think about the power of pictures. That cross spoke to a young man from the town of Assisi, still wearing his fancy clothes from his father's house, changed the young man's life, changed the history of the world. I mean, art, it can be pretty powerful. And so the fact is, with a little help from God, the fact is that the San Damiano crucifix is perhaps the most famous example of a historiated crucifix that shows us the Christ triumphant. Now, once we have the stigmata of Francis and we create this Bonaventure and the little flowers really makes a point of forming the image of Francis that will be passed down for posterity, the image being the Francis as alter a Christus. We're going to see a very interesting change that takes place in crucifixes. In this image of Francis, we see very prominently, this is one of the early, Francis has died, it's 2 years? No, it's 4 years. He dies in 26, he's canonized in 28, and this image was made in 30. Am I wrong on my dates here? Right? More or less? So you have almost immediately, and here we see Francis already demonstrating, already showing us these stigmata. We have the stories of Francis, these stories of the little flowers intended to really begin to very consciously parallel the life of Francis against the life of Christ. As a matter of fact, the entire program of Assisi will be based on this idea of Francis and Alter Christus. And then we get Coppo di Marcovaldo, who, by the way, spends an awful lot of time hanging around with the Franciscans. He's one of the first painters who's known to be working for the Franciscans from very early on. And what does he give us? He gives us a Christ who has died on the cross.